Hello, welcome back to the studio. In today's video, I'm going to be swatching some dot cards which I purchased from a small paint maker named Understory Supply Company. The footage for this video was actually recorded over 2 months ago when I intended to do a Vlogmas type challenge. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, but I did get a lot of great footage which I'll be putting out as a number of videos over the next few weeks. This does mean that I will be releasing a number of Christmassy type videos completely out of season in February and March, but I've decided that's okay. I do want to just get all of this content out because I did put so much effort into making it in the first place. The paints you see me swatching out today from Understory Supply Company, I will be using along with the paints that I swatched in my last video, linked up above, from E&L to create a lovely gnome painting with some Scandinavian folk art motifs. Understory Supply Company is a small, independent paint maker based in Vancouver Island. So from the Understory Supply Company website, the maker behind the paint's name is Sierra, they, them. They're a pigment artist, currently working on unceded Lekwungen territory on Vancouver Island. They craft watercolor paint from pigments found in nature, a passion that they built while hiking the Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. They talk about how every land base carries their own unique color palette, from the rocks and soils to the plants, the fungi, the skeletons and shells left behind by their residents. The paints offered by Understory Supply Company are all made from natural mineral and botanical pigments sourced from around the world and gathered by hand by Sierra. Understory Supply Company paints are crafted with natural earth-based pigments and botanical pigments. The watercolors are made with a simple combination of natural pigment and handmade binder. The binder contains acacia sap, honey, glycerin, clove oil, and water. The paints don't contain any fillers or other hidden ingredients. I ordered a random selection of dot cards and I received the following colors: Nettle, Marsh Marigold, Arnica, Venetian Red, Huckleberry, Cherry Blossom, Haiku Magnetite, Indigo, Cirrus, and Deep Moss. Unfortunately, the pigment composition of each of the paints is not listed anywhere on the packaging or on the website. I have not reached out to Understory Supply Company or Sierra to clarify what the pigments are in each of these paints, but these names of these paints are clearly made to be evocative rather than the nettle paint, for example, being made with nettle. This is a struggle that is pretty common with these handmade paint companies that have natural foraged paints. While I would love to really delve into more of these paints, it's a problem for me because I want to know the light fastness and long-term durability of the paints that I'm working with, and I can't know that unless I know exactly what's going into them. Now, on to the swatching. First up, nettle. Nettle is a moderately dull yellow-green color. It's relatively hard to re-wet and low to moderate tinting. It's a very pretty color. My guess is that this is a mix of a fairly hard yellow earth tone and some kind of green. It could also contain some natural green earth, although it is definitely more yellow and a bit stronger than most of the green earth pigments that I've seen. It has fairly low separation and a nice granulation pattern. I would say that it is semi-opaque or semi-transparent. The second paint I'm swatching is called Marsh Marigold. Again, this is not a pigment made out of marigolds by any means. It is a very light yellow earth tone, a very light yellow ochre probably. This is a very delicate color. Again, I'd say it's semi-opaque. relatively, like moderately hard to re-wet. Definitely a sort of pastel kind of shade. Next up, we have Huckleberry. Once again, this is an evocative name, not a description of the pigment. I would say this is likely a Mars Violet or a Caput Mortuum sort of color. Again, I'm finding this quite muted. There's a little bit of a whitish tint almost, which surprises me from a paint that otherwise to me looks like a Venetian Violet, Caput Mortuum sort of color. They tend to be a lot more powerful. I'm finding it rather hard to re-wet. It does have some very lovely texture that's coming through, a very nice granulation pattern. So that's quite nice. But all of these paints so far have been relatively hard to re-wet and lower tinting overall. The next paint I'm swatching is Venetian Red. This one is a fair bit easier to re-wet than any of the previous three paints. It is, however, surprisingly transparent and low tinting for a Venetian Red. Otherwise, the Venetian Red does match with the general tone of that I would expect from a Venetian Red. Again, we don't have any pigment information, but I would assume that this is a regular sort of Venetian Red pigment. I'm curious because Venetian Red is often made with PR101, which, while it is an earth color, is a synthetic iron oxide. So it's has some human involvement in its production. It's possible that this is a different source, and maybe that's why the pigment is a little bit lighter, but again, without any pigment information, I can't really know. Next, I'm swatching Haiku Magnetite. While none of these paints are labeled with a pigment code, this paint, Haiku Magnetite, is one of the paints that is hand foraged by the paintmaker, so she has included a lot more information about what the pigment is. According to the description on the website, this is a heavily granulating and separating color made of magnetite collected from the Arkansas River. Sierra continues to say this paint is really special as the magnetic particles can be manipulated before the paint dries on the page. Give in to the unpredictable textures, see where they lead you. Now, I didn't have a magnet handy to really make the most of this magnetite paint, but I will say that it definitely has some very strongly noticeable granulation and separation, and I can see the magnetite, the black magnetic particles in that granulation, so I imagine that if you were to run a magnet over it, you would get some really interesting sort of linear fur patterns appearing, and that could be really fun. Another thing that caught my attention about this paint in particular is that I found it among the easiest to re-wet of the paints that I'd tried so far. This surprises me, as often hand-foraged pigments, they tend to be a little bit coarser, and it's a little bit more difficult to get a well-behaving paint out of them. But to my surprise, this magnetite paint seems to be one of the easiest to re-wet. It paints out really strongly compared to some of the other ones. Great job, I really like this paint. Next, I'm swatching Deep Moss. Again, this is an evocative name. This is not a paint made out of moss. I'm sorry I sound like a broken record, but it's important for me to make these distinctions. This is a deep, dark green color, a little bit more yellowish than, say, a Perylene green. It's also got a mild amount of granulation, and it's semi-opaque. In the painting that I'll share with you in my next video, I'll be using this as a sort of mixing color to create some shadows. It's definitely a very saturated dark paint. It is fairly easy to re-wet, so there's clearly some variation within this line. Some of these colors are more delicate, whereas some of them are much more powerful. Arnica is my next paint to swatch. This one is similar to the Marsh Marigold directly above it, although it is a little bit stronger and I would say a little bit more saturated, maybe slightly less of an orange tone overall, but mostly it's just very slightly brighter. I would say these are both likely made with some kind of yellow ochre, just very slightly different types. One of them is more of a Caucasian skin tone with a slight yellow tint, and the other one is more of like a clear earth yellow. I found this one moderately easy to re-wet, although again the tinting strength is really low, so that's going to be a challenge to work into pieces with. Next, I painted out Cherry Blossom, which is very clearly a mix of pigments. There's some kind of reddish something in it, possibly a botanical or earth pigment mixed with some kind of white. Again, without more information, I can't really know what's in this. It is definitely a pastel tone, evocative of cherry blossoms. I don't tend to use these pastel colors very much in my own work, so probably this wouldn't be the most useful for me, although I will try to work it into the painting that I'm creating with these paints, just to give it a shot. Next up, we have Cirrus, which is a lovely muted blue tone. I would say this is similar to like a cerulean, maybe a chromium cerulean that's a little bit darker and deeper. It has some very interesting textures. It's semi-transparent. This would be really nice to use in sort of stormy skies. That's probably how I'm going to use it in the piece that I'm working on next. And finally, we have Indigo. Now, Indigo is very interesting because I had previously tried Indigo from E&L, and whereas the other paints by E&L are all much, much brighter than the Understory Supply paints, this is actually the reason why I decided to swatch these paints and include them in the painting that I'm making next, is that I needed to have a deep shadow tone, and the Indigo from E&L is really, really wimpy. The Indigo from Understory is beautiful. This is one of the best natural indigos. Again, there's no pigment information, but I'm assuming that this is PB1, or I believe maybe it's actually NB1, but that it's actually just natural indigo in this. But it is a beautiful, beautiful, deep, nearly black in mass tone, waters out to a very clear, deep blue, like a navy color, a little bit of a green tone in there. It is transparent, but because it's so saturated, you can't see the black line underneath, just because it's very nearly black. So this is a beautiful, beautiful indigo. Again, indigo is not a light fast color, so this is not something that I would get for light fastness, but it could definitely be useful in a sketching set. This is one of the most beautiful indigo paints that I've ever seen. I'm curious to hear from you which of these paints you would be interested in trying, if any. Overall, my impression of Understory Supply Company, at least from this first swatch out, is that it's one of these companies that I would love to love, if that makes sense. I really admire and I'm interested in the concept of pigment making and foraging, and I really want to support people who are playing with that. But because I'm so fussy about knowing what's in my paints, it ends up bothering me when paints are made and there's these evocative names, but there's no details about what the pigments going into the paints are. I also found that many of these paints were quite light, delicate, which again is not a problem necessarily, but that's not the paint qualities that I prefer to work with. However, there are a couple of standouts here. So this indigo is gorgeous. I would definitely consider buying a pan of this indigo. I also really liked the Haiku Magnetite, which is one of the hand-forged paints. And looking at the website, they also have a few other hand-forged paints that even from their swatches look like some of the brightest in the selection, so I'm curious about those. Anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I will be a lot more present here in the near future, hopefully. So if you could give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.